Architect Meera Milan Ajit. She is currently working as a senior architect at L&T Construction, Buildings and Factories. She has worked for various commercial and institutional projects for the Engineering Design Research Centre, ranging from shopping malls, IT parks to metro rails. She has attended many national conferences and seminars. She has also worked as a freelancer in Chennai for various projects.
Welcome to UGC lecture series Architecture. I'll be taking you through History of Architecture and Culture 3 AR6302 lecture 7. In this lecture you will be seeing the unit 5 of this particular subject, that is Baroque and Rococo architecture. This lecture will cover the first part of this particular unit. In the previous lectures of the subject you would have seen how Christian architecture came in, evolved, how Basilican concept came, how Byzantine concept came. It moved to Gothic architecture, then Romanesque architecture, and then Renaissance architecture, and now you will be moving into a later stage of the Renaissance architecture called the Baroque and Rococo architecture. In this particular lecture, you can see you will be going through Baroque architecture, Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation is like an immediate, very important period in the Christian history. So that led to a lot of direct impact in architecture and Baroque and Rococo period, and that's why to understand what is Protestant Reformation is very important. So we are covering that. Then St. Peter's, Rome. St. Peter's Basilica being the most important church of Christianity. This is the lecture which covers that architecture of that particular church. And then you have the Palace of Versailles. So that's which we will cover in this particular lecture. First and foremost, we will see the Baroque architecture. You can see slightly what is the Baroque architecture. This picture directly implies the grandeur of the Baroque architecture. That's why I put this picture in the beginning of the lecture itself, so that you can understand how clustered and how more elaborate the architecture style of the Baroque culture was. So first and foremost we will see what is the Protestant Reformation all about. Okay, the Protestant Reformation is often simply referred to as Reformation because that is the reformation of the history of Christianity. It was a schism from the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century Europe. So what happened in the 16th century Europe? I said that previously in the lectures you saw how Christianity came, it conquered, it became something, and Europe was completely under Christianity. Europe took Christianity as its sole major religion, and Catholic understanding, Catholic belief started, Pope culture started. So all these things were the major things that contributed to the Christian architecture of that era. So along with the architecture, many sectors of the society, including literature, science, humanities, everything, everything kind of happened around this particular Christian thought or Christian outlook. So Pope was the single most important person of the religion and of all the society even. So they kind of looked up to him, or even the bishops or even the priests, to tell them what to do next, or how to dictate how art, architecture, literature, anything related to science and culture be. So what happened in the 16th century in Europe? There was a significant already there were like many attempts to reform the Catholic Church, but Martin Luther is widely acknowledged to have started the Reformation. Martin Luther was a German professor of theology, a composer, a priest, and a former monk. So what happened? Martin Luther wrote a book with which this reform started happening against the principles of the Roman Catholic Church, and that was what is called the Protestant Reformation, or that is what ignited the Protestant Reformation. So Luther began by criticizing the selling of indulgences, the selling of principles, the selling of morals by a Christian church, by the Pope, and he said that the Pope had no authority over the purgatory. So that is what he said, and that is what started the the reform against the Roman Catholic Church, and that is what is called the Protestant Reformation. So this is a picture of Martin Luther, and see, the core motivation behind these changes was very theological, though many other factors played a part. So there was a rise of nationalism, there was Western schism. So all these things, whatever happened, his book, this ideologies, all these side by side, or whatever moment happened, that kind of eroded the people's faith in the papacy. So this impacted the humanism and the new learning of Renaissance, which questioned the traditional thought of Christianity or the papacism. So what happened? As I said, humanism happened, all these things were happening simultaneously, but what happened? This Protestant Reformation had a direct impact in the Baroque architecture, which you will know why. See, Baroque architecture at the same time, as I said, happened between 1600 to 1750, and Baroque means very fancy or elaborate or over decorated spaces. See, what happened? Till then, architecture was kind of, the beginning of the Christian period, if you talk about, architecture was very simple, very straightforward. It had its own understanding. Okay, this is what I want from a particular building. This is what I will, so that is what I'm going to give in my particular building. So my building is going to be made in order to provide the people the kind of function they expect from that particular space. So that was what architecture was all about. Later what happened, as time moved by, architecture slowly evolved, Christian architecture I mean, it slowly evolved into something that is like more, even very much related to what aesthetics, as in aesthetics added to function, architects kind of added to the aesthetics of the space along with the functionality. So it went hand in hand to some extent. Later, as things went by, functionality became a part of it and aesthetics became more of it. So Baroque is kind of an architecture style which kind of brought in more of an aesthetic understanding rather than more the functions of the particular space, because that is how much they gave importance to decoration or elaborate space and fancy decorations and fancy murals, and finally it was very clustered and very over decorated space, which kind of became like really tough for the human eye to digest, because that many colors and that many small spaces had so many colors and so many elaborate workmen. That is what Baroque architecture is all about. So moving on, Baroque architecture came from the Portuguese word Baroca, which means a pearl of irregular shape. So that itself tells you what is Baroque architecture all about. It is like very irregular, very nasty, very out there form of architecture. So it's the building style of the Baroque era that took the Roman vocabulary of Renaissance architecture and used it in a new rhetorical and theoretical fashion. So they took the Roman vocabulary as such and then they made it like into a theater, a vast drama, a drama which is like so elaborate, so that they thought that is how they can reach the people, or that's how they can revolt against the Protestantism. So this was often to express the triumph of the Catholic Church and the absolute state. It was characterized by new explorations of form, light, shadows and dramatic intensity. So the basic idea of this particular architecture to come into place, or this era to come into place itself, was to prove the triumph of the Catholic Church over the Protestant Reformation, and that was the main idea why Baroque architecture came into existence itself. So moving on, in these pictures you can see a lot of this is basically how the Baroque architecture, like various examples of Baroque architecture. This St. Peter's Basilica is also one of the main important example of the Baroque architecture. It implies strangeness, irregularity and extravaganza. When Baroque happened, it happened such that they decided to create something like really, like there was no stop for the human eye. It moved from one color to another color, one shape to another shape. Even in paintings, there was no rest to the eye of the beholder, because what happens, you see something, then another thing starts, then another thing starts, then another. It's like goes from, there was no rest to the eye. It was like that irregular and that extravagant, the idea of Baroque architecture. So initially, at least, it was directly linked to the Counter-Reformation, a movement within the Catholic Church to reform itself in response to the Protestant Reformation, as I said. So Baroque architecture and its establishments were on one hand more accessible to the emoticons, and on the other hand a visible statement of the power and wealth of the church, because that many small things they added to the architecture, that was like that kind of implied how much powerful and wealthy the church was. So Baroque architecture was not just one style, it was a fusion of multiple styles. It included motion, it included energy, it included dramatic control, it included extravaganza, it included everything. That was not one thing, it was kind of a fusion of multiple ideas put together as one. So St. Peter's Basilica, as I said, is one major example of Baroque architecture. So it was brilliantly colorful, passionate artworks, and they were fascinated about light. Okay, so they used light and color to dissolve form, by having a very dark background. So they had dark background over which they had colors. They had, passages from where light came in. So all these things kind of played like, blend together and played along with the dark background. So that created the more mesmerizing ideology of the Baroque architecture. Moving on, it used contrast colors to heighten dramatic effect, as I just said. So now moving on, we learn about St. Peter's Basilica to understand about Baroque architecture. So just before moving on to the cathedral, let me just brief you the certain distinctive features of Baroque architecture. You can see in the background, this is one Baroque painting that happened long back. So that itself shows how previously the paintings were more, there were colors in, but then the ideas was more many of the paintings were dedicated to the Almighty, or there were like many more details to it, but Baroque paintings had a very different outlook. You can see that, but there's a lot of similarities with Baroque, between Baroque and Rococo painting, that you will learn later in the next lecture. So basically in Baroque architecture, in churches, broader naves were given sometimes oval forms. Fragmentary or deliberately incomplete architectural element, as I said, deliberately or fragmentary incomplete architecture elements were used in this particular architecture, which is like very important feature of this. Dramatic use of light, as I said, either strong or shade contrast. Opulent use of color and ornaments, which was very deliberate, and they wanted the colors were the things which actually created a kind of a mesmerism to the eyes. The large scale ceiling frescoes and an external facade often characterized by a dramatic central projection. So this is St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, which is the most important church in the world. That is because the Pope resides in this particular basilica, and that's why this is like the most important part of Catholic belief, this church. So this was constructed between AD 1506 to 1626. It was the most important building erected in the period, and many architects were engaged upon it. It was not a single architect that was part of this. Many architects were part of this. This shows the interior of this particular basilica. The plan was a Greek cross. The later extension of the nave and aisles actually made the plan more like a very linear Latin cross. So it was designed principally by Donato Bramante, Michelangelo, Carlo Modeno, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. They were like the main architects of this particular cathedral, whereas Bramante, Michelangelo and Bernini were given, are one of the most famous artists of all time. So they are known to be the most important factors or architects of this particular basilica. This is the plan of St. Peter's, Rome. This is the entrance arcade, which is like the most striking feature of this particular church, and there is an obelisk in the center, which kind of makes the most important view of this particular. This is that area, and this is the church behind. So this was this was probably effected so as to close in the area in whole of a previously existing church. So what happened, as I said, the previously Latin cross, a cross was the plan. Later they extended the nave and aisle to make it a Latin cross. So that particular thing was probably done in order to close the whole area that was a part of the previously existing church at that particular area. That previous church, the previously existing St. Peter's Church in that area, we studied in the first lecture of this particular history, that is Byzantine and Basilican concept of architecture. That is when this particular church came in, like long back. So Renaissance, it's a Renaissance church in the Vatican City, the papal enclave within the city of Rome. And it's one of the largest churches in the world. As I said, it's actually one of the largest religious spaces in the world, not just churches. If you see any religious space, one of the richest and largest religious space in the world. It's regarded as one of the holiest cathedrals. So Catholic tradition holds that Basilica is the burial site of Saint Peter, one of Christ's apostles and also the first pope. So they believe that St. Peter's tomb is directly below the high altar of this basilica, and that is why this basilica is that important to the Christianity. So there has been a church on this site, as I said, the time of Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. The construction of the present basilica began in 1506 and was completed on 18 November 1626. So St. Peter's Rome had the nave, which is 80 feet wide nave, and it consists of 4 bays of immense size. So the central crossing is covered by the dome, which is 137 feet and 6 inches in diameter. You can see the plan. This is the area where the dome covers, and this is the interior of the dome. So this is one of the largest domes of all times. The short transepts were terminated by the semicircular apses, and the western apse was precisely similar. The high altar stands under the dome with a 100 feet high over the alley tomb of St. Peter. So the high altar stands under the dome, and under that is the burial site of St. Peter. So see, this is the panorama of that whole St. Peter's Basilica. If you see, you can see the whole basilica here. So the vestibule at the end extends the whole width of the church, and the chancel was at the west end. One author particularly wrote that only gradually does St. Peter's dawn upon us. As we watch the people draw near to this or that monument, strangely they appear to be like really shrink. So actually that he said that people kind of were dwarfed with the monumentality of that particular space, and that's how huge and that is how monumental that particular church was or is. I mean, that is how important that particular church is, because everything about that particular church was monumental. Everything about that particular church was like beyond human perception or beyond human insight. It was like everything about the church was like one step above extraordinary, and that's how it was created at that particular point of time also. So something that was created like so long back still holds to be one of the wonders, one of the most toughest architectural monument to build. So that's how important the architecture of this particular church is. Moving on, the interior of the St. Peter's Rome has one gigantic order of Corinthian pilasters. You can see in the picture, this is the Corinthian columns. I mean, Corinthian columns were you basically used. So that see, amongst the columns, Corinthian was the toughest order to make. It was very much more intricately detailed than the Doric or Ionic columns. So inside St. Peter's Basilica, there was a particular use of this Corinthian columns, and it was crowned with semicircular barrel walls 150 feet high. So the walls were faced with plaster and color to imitate marble, producing a rich effect, and the dome is beautifully decorated in mosaic. So you can see, as I said, the interior of the dome is extremely decorated with mosaic, and that kind of creates the most dramatic effect within the church, and the lights which comes inside adds upon it. The exterior of this particular church, you can see this is the facade of the church, and this also roughly is roughly executed in travertine, has an immense order of Corinthian plasters. You can see these are the Corinthian orders in the fronts, You can see the Corinthian columns. It's 108 feet high, including entablature, with an attic 39 feet high surrounding the entire building. So, this is the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. You can see the cross section of this particular dome. You can see there were like, the dome of St. Peter rises to a total height of 136.57 meters from the floor of the basilica to the top of the external cross to this. Okay, from the floor of the particular basilica to this point, it is 136.57 meters, and it is the tallest dome in the world. Its external diameter is 41.47 meters, and is slightly smaller than 2 or 3 of the other huge domes that preceded it. To the maybe the Pantheon and the Florence Cathedral were like more broader than that, but other than that, it is really big in diameter. It is 47.47 meters in diameter. So, the view of the dome from the east, except at a distance, is nearly cut off behind the screen wall of the now extended nave. As I said, the nave and aisles were extended. This kind of previously what happened, this nave and aisles, where before the nave and aisles were extended, the dome was particularly seen. Now from many parts of the facade, you can see from far the view of the dome is kind of hidden because of the extended wall of the nave. So, the design owes much to the circular, the 4 flooded colonnades. So, this is the particular colonnade I was talking about, because the design of this particular church, or the reason why this particular church is like this big, is because of this colonnade, which was added later by Bernini in the 17th century, which is one of the noblest entrance courtyards in Europe. It is considered to be one of the noblest entrance courtyard in Europe. There is an obelisk in the center, and this place makes it it makes it itself shows how vast and inhumane the proportion is, like huge the proportion is, and people feel like really small in front of that massive architectural wonder called St. Peter's Basilica. So, moving on, we will learn about French Baroque. Now, what we learned was Italian Baroque till now. In Italy, as I said, we learned about Florence, Rome and Vatican, now we learn about the French Baroque. The center of the Baroque secular architecture actually was France. In the other side, Baroque was more religious and more devoted to God Almighty, and France was the center of the secular Baroque architecture, where the open 3-wing layout of the palace was established as a canonical solution as early as in the 16th century. You can see this is an example of the French Baroque architecture in the background. It was the Palais du Luxembourg by Salomon de Bros that determined the sober and classicizing direction that French Baroque architecture was to take. So, it was not a very as extravagant as the Italian Baroque. Italian Baroque, as I said, was like really flamboyant, whereas it is very, French Baroque was like very sober and very classy in nature. Moving on, this is the Palace of Versailles, which is like the most important example of the French Baroque architecture. This is the aerial view of that particular palace. This was built in AD 1664. This is the facade of the palace, and the Palace of Versailles, or simply Versailles, is a royal chateau in the Versailles in France. It is also known as the Château de Versailles. The court of Versailles was the center of political power in France from 1682, when Louis XVI moved from Paris, until the royal family was forced to return to the capital in 1789 after the beginning of the French Revolution. So, French Revolution was very, very important in the history of France. So, in order to understand the architecture, the later period architecture of France, understanding of French Revolution is like very important. So, French Revolution is a period of far-reaching social and political upheaval in France, and that lasted from 1789 until 1799 and was partially carried forward by Napoleon during the later expansion of the French Empire. So, the revolution kind of overthrew the monarchy, established a republic, experienced violent period of political turmoil, and finally culminated in a dictatorship under Napoleon, and that brought about a very very different era of France. So that's why French Renaissance is revolution is like very very important, because later it inspired a lot of liberal, it was inspired by a lot of liberal and radical ideas. So it profoundly altered the course of modern history, triggering the global decline of absolute monarchies while replacing them with republics and liberal democracies. So later whatever was there before French Revolution was slowly made to change the idea, from the ideas to the techniques to the buildings, or whatever was important at that point of time was slowly made to change after the French Revolution. So that kind of made a mark in the French architecture also. So as you can see, this is the Palace of Versailles. This is the exterior and this is the interior of the palace. This was done by Jules Haddon Mansart, who lived between 1647 to 1708, for Louis XVI, as I said, and is remarkable only for the uniformity and tameness of his design. You can see the interior, you can see extremely over decorated space, extra use of colors, like very 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 eye catchy colors were used, and that's like that itself shows the Baroque ideology of that particular construction. The dimensions are very large. The central projection measured around 320 feet and each wing 500 feet, and thus giving a total of 1320 feet. Le Notre laid out the gardens which with their own fountains, terraces and arbors were very fine. So what happened, this particular architecture was very masculine, it was huge, it was very monumental in size, very large. So that kind of brought in the characteristics of Baroque architecture in France. So if you can see, this is the plan of the Palace of Versailles, and there is a central court or Court Royale. And now moving on to the summary of this particular lecture. We saw the introduction to the Baroque style of architecture, its influences and architectural features, wherein we learned how Baroque style came in, what was the importance of Baroque style, how its architecture features of this particular style was. We understood the basic ideology of the Protest Reformation and its significance in the Baroque architecture, and how it directly or indirectly affected the architecture of that particular era. Detailed understanding of the architecture of St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, the most important church in the Catholic amongst the Catholic Christians, that we saw. Then we saw French Baroque and understood the French Revolution and its impacts in the French Baroque architecture, and then we saw the architecture of the Palace of Versailles, which is the most important example of the French Baroque architecture, and we understood the basic small differences between the Italian Baroque and the French Baroque architecture. Moving on to the questions. Explain Baroque style of architecture with one example. Explain in detail the architecture of St. Peter, Rome with illustrations. Discuss the features of French Baroque with an example. Explain the architecture of the Palace of Versailles. That is all for this lecture. In the next lecture, you will be seeing the next part of this Baroque and Rococo architecture chapter, and in that you will be seeing what are the other reforms which started after the Baroque architecture and the Rococo architecture and its examples. Thank you.